welcome to the Quality Associates webinar on getting to grips with Listeria monocytogenes. It's quite an important topic, and so we'll spend about half an hour actually talking through the background of the organism and how we might best manage that organism as well. Just waiting for the next slide. My name is Andreas, and I'll be talking you through this session today. My background is in technical management in retail in Coles and in the UK with Marks and Spencer's, and worked in various roles at the University of Adelaide and in Queensland, looking at food quality and food safety. My current role, I'm one of the directors of Quality Associates and head up our training organizations as well. For me, my whole career is really about getting great products out to consumers, but to give them also confidence, and if you're a manufacturer or retailer, that you actually produce foods that are safe for consumers to consume.
It should come out from the left of the head.
No, it shouldn't.
So we provide different services to a whole range of businesses in the food industry, whether they are retailer partners or FMCG. We deal with all of the different aspects from seafood, meat, and so on. Sorry, I'm just going to mute you again, Keith, because you keep coming back as I'm talking over the session. So if you could just stay on mute, that would be great. We do have a service from consulting, specifications and labeling, product testing. And so from that point of view, we see a lot of specifications that deal with organisms like Listeria monocytogenes. We look at customer complaints. We deal with recalls, and they include recalls that actually were triggered by Listeria monocytogenes. So we act as a recall sponsor in that space. And as I've mentioned, we also provide training. But what we really want to talk about today is Listeria monocytogenes. On this slide here, you can see the type of organism it is. It's small, rod-shaped, it's actually mobile, and on the left-hand side with the red cells, that's Listeria mono trying to get into human cells. And that's when it becomes an issue. On the right-hand side, the green colored pictures, those red dots, that's Listeria monocytogenes inside human cells. And that's when the trouble really starts for people with weak immune systems. And we'll have a look at that as we go through the session today as well. So the three main topics I want to really cover today are, first of all, why Listeria monocytogenes is such a successful pathogen. From the point of view of the organism, it gives us lots of challenges. For it, it's successful. For us, it's a real problem. We also want to see why Listeria mono has such an impact on vulnerable populations. And then at the end, we'll look at some of the food safety strategies that we're implementing in the food industry today and where things might go in the future as well. So let's have a look at the success of Listeria monocytogenes and why it is such an issue. So first of all, on the left, you've got the family tree. So Listeria mono is not the only Listeria organism. There are other species, 5 other ones in fact, but Listeria mono is not just one organism. There are lots of different variants of that. And if you look on the right-hand side, there's a whole range of lineages. And if you look at lineage 1, the organism there with the red square 4B, that's basically the specific serotype that has caused significant issues over the last few years and resulted in a significant number of deaths around the world. And so specific Listeria mono lineages and serotypes may have very different types of pathogenicity. Some may be much more aggressive than others, and we start seeing the emergence of specific types as well. So where do we find Listeria mono then? First of all, it's a global dispersal. We see it wherever we go in the world, and wherever you look at ecological niches, you'll find it. It's in soil and dust. So if you are walking into your factory and you don't change your shoes, for example, potentially you now have Listeria mono on your feet and you're walking it straight into the factory. And that sort of issue drives a lot how we actually deal with that organism in a manufacturing setting. You'll find it in water. In particular, if you have things like dams with rotting vegetation, you're going to find Listeria mono there as well. You can find it associated with food crops. And we'll see a little bit later on, one of the major recalls in Australia was for rock melons. And that was because food crops in the field can become contaminated with Listeria mono. It's also carried by a whole range of animals, including pests. And so if we're then thinking how we protect our foods from Listeria mono, we basically need to start thinking what happens on our food manufacturing sites. We need to start looking in drains and floors and wet areas where you tend to find Listeria mono. Food contact surfaces obviously are critical. We don't want to find Listeria mono where our food is going to be in contact with those surfaces. And so our cleaning programs and so on are going to be critical in this space. And if you're dealing with commercial kitchens and those sort of things, you need to start thinking it is in sinks, it's in drains, it's potentially in the fridge as well. And so we need to start thinking how we manage all of those processes. So Listeria mono is a tough organism. There's a whole range of reasons why I say that, but the first one, and that's a really important one for the food industry where we rely on low temperatures to protect our foods, Listeria mono can grow below 1 degree Celsius. So if we refrigerate foods below 5, we're going to have issues with Listeria mono potentially because it can grow at those temperatures. Now, what protects us is the lag time. It takes some time before Listeria mono starts going. And so in the fridge, it could take anywhere between 1 to 8 days, for example, before the organism starts growing. And if it's present in numbers and it doesn't grow during that stage, then basically we are protected from increasing numbers and therefore from potential food safety risks. But once it starts going, you can see the generation time. Typical temperatures in the fridge, it could easily get doubling every half day to day. So if you're then thinking about a shelf life and you're thinking about, say, a factor of 100 increase in Listeria mono, you've got 3.5 days or so before that number is going to be exceeded based on one organism being present. So low temperatures give us some protection, it slows it down, but compared to other pathogens, it doesn't stop growth altogether. Listeria can grow in a wide pH range, pH 3 to 12, that's huge for foods. And most food tends to fall into those parameters. It's highly salt tolerant. It tolerates water activity down to 0.9. That's quite low for a pathogen compared to other bacterial pathogens that may not grow, say, below 0.97. And it grows under anaerobic conditions. So if you think modified atmosphere packaging of foods protects you from Listeria, it does exactly the opposite. It knocks out a lot of other organisms that might suppress Listeria, but Listeria can quite happily grow under those conditions. And Listeria is great at forming biofilms. So cells clump together, stick to surfaces, and exude an extracellular matrix that protects it against stress and sanitizes. So it's much harder to kill and get rid of once you get this biofilm formation. So there's things we need to keep in mind. Now, Listeria mono has one Achilles heel, and that is it's easy to kill with heat. So typical time and temperature combinations that I've shown you here are things like 60 degrees for 45 minutes, but only takes about a second at 85 degrees. And a typical Listeria cook in the industry would be 72 degrees for 2 minutes, and we make sure that all the food is exposed to that temperature. We know that will kill Listeria. So this is basically a 6-log reduction, which is equivalent to a normal pasteurization step. So we know that we can use that in the foods and when we prepare foods, but we need to be mindful we actually achieve those conditions. So that's a little bit about why it's causing us so many problems. But there are two sides that we need to consider. The first one, that the organism actually grows and comes up into high numbers to cause issues. And the second is who's actually vulnerable to this organism. And so if we look at the food legislation, food standards code and so on, basically there's specific provisions for vulnerable populations. So the effect of Listeria on people that are vulnerable to this organism is called listeriosis. You get symptoms after, say, 3 to 90 days, so that's quite a wide range of days. And typically, you're going to get symptoms after about 3 weeks. If it's invasive, so people with poor immune systems that are going to be susceptible to this organism, quite often you're going to find the first symptoms of invasive listeriosis after about 8 days. In pregnancy-associated cases, it's about a month, so 28 days. Now, if you have a good immune system, you might feel a bit of fever, tiredness, headaches, or you think you might have a flu, and eventually you get over it. But when you have invasive listeriosis, it can become fatal for people that are susceptible through meningitis, septicemia, and encephalitis. And if you look back at that image that I'm showing you on the right, once you have those organisms in your cells, they can start doing a lot of damage to you and your health. And if you think about invasive listeriosis, the statistics are truly shocking. If you look at general mortality rates, or people that have an infection with various food poisoning organisms, Listeria monocytogenes has a mortality rate of about 20 to 30%. Salmonella, which we all know is not very healthy for us, it's less than 0.5%. If you look at Campylobacter and Vibrio species that can also be relatively common, basically you look at a fraction of a percent. It's not a high percentage of people that are going to die because of this. But if you're an unborn or neonate, if you're aged, if you're hospitalized, you have a high chance of actually dying from this organism. On the right-hand side, I'm showing a few statistics, and basically the light blue and yellow basically shows the fatalities associated with notifications in Australia. But the other statistic below that is a telling story, and it shows us that people that are older are much more susceptible. So any foods going into nursing homes, hospitals, those sort of places where older people are exposed, the risk for those people is very, very significant. So if you then have a look at the communication from the health authorities, including FAIFST and so on, there's a whole lot of communication about foods to avoid if you're at risk of listeriosis. So things like cold meats, cold cooked ready-to-eat chicken, since last year rock melon as well, because it's a very difficult product to actually sanitize and keep safe. Any prepared or pre-packed fruits and salads, including from buffets and salad bars. And I've added seed sprouts into that because they can also be a source of Listeria, salmonella, and so on, and are also a high-risk food. Chilled seafoods like raw oysters, sashimi, sushi, those sort of things. Smoked, ready-to-eat, salmon, for example. All the semi-soft and soft cheeses, refrigerated pâtés, soft serve ice creams, and unpasteurized dairy products are all high-risk products. And if you're aged or if you are pregnant, they're the sort of foods that you wouldn't eat if you try to avoid Listeria. Yeah, a couple of recalls that came across the industry in the last year or so. So I've mentioned the rock melon outbreak in Australia last year. 6 people died from that. 1 lady lost her baby through a miscarriage. So a very, very serious impact. And that was from a source where people hadn't really considered much of a risk associated with that. And then in South Africa was the biggest ever Listeria outbreak, the most severe that was ever recorded. And that comes back to this Listeria monocytogenes group 4b, and that basically this particular organism, and ST stands for sequence type 6, but basically nearly 1,000 people became ill, nearly 200 people died, and it took them months to figure out where that actually came from. And the same organism actually caused a recall for frozen vegetables. That was a recall that impacted 50 countries, including Australia. Below are the products that were basically recalled in Australia, that were imported into Australia. And you would have thought frozen vegetables, that's not a high-risk group. We're going to cook it, and we're going to kill Listeria because of that. But fundamentally, people still died in Europe. We had one death associated with this organism in Australia, but we don't know what the food source was, because that person could obviously not be interviewed. But basically, you also have to assume that some people eat, for example, frozen corn kernels raw. And so therefore, you're not going to have a sufficient kill step. And in this case, it was the European Food Safety Authority that actually mandated a recall that then reached into Australia as well. And we were forced to act in conjunction with them. And then on the right-hand side, basically that happened a couple of months ago or so, where basically a nursing home was supplied with a commercially kitchen-prepared meal. An elderly woman died from Listeria mono poisoning. And you can imagine that the authorities really started to freak out, because now you have a nursing home that's being supplied with this food containing Listeria mono. You have one death, and it takes some time before other people might get sick. So it's very hard to predict what's going to happen after that. And you see from the note below from the ABC News, Meals on Wheels were impacted as well. So commercial kitchens, as much as food manufacturers, have a major role to play in managing this microorganism. All right, so we've looked a bit why Listeria is successful, why it becomes an issue for specific people. But let's have a look at what we can actually do to manage that in a safe manner. And so first of all, we really need to know what the areas of risk are. And these pictures are just simply snapshots of spaces and places in a commercial kitchen or in a factory where Listeria is going to hide out. And that is in those cracks. And if you have paint that's starting to break down and pitting, if you have gaps in between different pieces of metal, like in the top left images, you're going to have problems. If your stainless steel looks pitted and corroded, like on the right-hand side, if they're poor welds, that's where Listeria is going to hide out. It's going to hide out in drains, in particular when drains are connected all the way to the final drain and there's no gap in between to make sure the organism can't grow back up the drain again. You find it in condensation drip trays. And again, it's a cool place, but Listeria doesn't mind. You find it on wheels and ball bearings and sponges and split hoses and all sorts of things. You carry it through in all of the areas that are wet and you walk through, like in those sort of corridors that's shown on the right. So there are lots of places under floor mats, condensation points, all those sort of areas where Listeria will hide out, and we will have to deal with that. There's a number of different foods that are at high risk of Listeria. We've seen that already from the list that Food Standards Australia and New Zealand has published. So they're ready to eat or ready to heat foods. And if they're ready to eat, they're not going to get any further kill step and not going to be heated again. And so as a consequence of Listeria is there, it's going to be a problem. And with ready to heat foods, we need to be mindful that people may not actually heat them sufficiently to kill Listeria. So again, it's a potential issue. And at the very minimum, if you have ready to heat foods, you need to have very sound cooking instructions. That's your protection. You need to tell consumers how they actually get to a point where the food is actually made safe by that cooking step. Those ready to eat and ready to heat foods, what we worry about, especially with pre-cooked sort of foods, is that post-process contamination can occur. And so that's where we then now need to start looking at where that cook and that packing process occurs and how we keep Listeria mono away from there. If Listeria monocytogenes can grow in a food and you find Listeria monocytogenes in that food, you can be pretty sure that you're going to do a recall. And that's because during that growth, you just have to exceed 100 CFU or colony forming units per gram, and that's an infective dose. That's enough to make people sick. And so any growth can quite quickly lead to those sort of numbers. So if you find it, you're going to look at a recall. And you have to be mindful if you're testing for Listeria mono and the lab finds it in your food during testing, that is going to require mandatory reporting to the health authorities, to the food safety authorities. And so therefore they will know that that is found in the food, and they will have a discussion with you regarding appropriate action. And that can often include recalls as well, follow up on cleaning and sanitizing, and how you manage your facility. So in the Food Standards Code, we've got some definitions of foods that do not support growth. And that's, if we can be in that space, is quite useful. So if a pH is less than 4.4, regardless of water activity or AW. If the water activity or AW is less than 0.92, Food Standards Code says we're not going to expect growth. Or you have a combination of two. So we're looking at a hurdle concept. So if it is less, water activity less than 0.94 and the pH is less than 5, those two hurdles together are also sufficient. If food is frozen and it's going to be consumed frozen, or it's thawed just immediately before consumption, it's generally considered not to support growth. Otherwise, the food must not have a longer shelf life than 5 days. 5 days is not a lot. Unless you can validate that the level of Listeria mono during shelf life does not increase by more than half a log CFU, so colony forming units per gram during the shelf life. So half a log is virtually nothing. It's going from 10 to 15. It's going from 100 to 150. So that's half a log. It's going from 1 to 1.5. So you need to have some data that actually backs up that the product does not support more growth than that during shelf life. In any other circumstances, basically the Food Standards Code assumes that the food will support Listeria monocytogenes growth. So that gives us a few things to think about for those high-risk foods. So what can we actually do about it? So there are a number of different mitigation strategies, and I'll mention 10 in the next few slides. So the first one that's quite common in the food industry, and we've been doing that for the last 20, 25 years, is to start zoning our environment. And basically we're looking at zones where we're going to keep Listeria monocytogenes and other food pathogens out of that area. And there are two different zones that we talk about. There's a high risk zone. So that's basically a food that's been cooked and it's now going into a high risk zone where we're excluding Listeria mono, and we're going to keep it in there until the food is sealed in the food container. So that's a high risk zone. And then we have a high care zone. It's the same except for uncooked products. Either way, we need to make sure that the food that gets into that area, and that includes all the raw materials and packaging and those sort of things as well, get into that high risk or high care zone in a safe manner. And on the right, there are some examples of how you can actually do that. You could have a wash tunnel. You can have a double bagging hatch. So basically where the person on the outside of the zone opens the outer bag and the person on the inside takes a hygienic, clean inner bag and pulls that through into the high care or high risk zone so that you're not actually bringing new microorganisms in. You can cook into these areas. So you basically, the uncooked food goes in one door, and then there's a door on the other side going into the high risk zone where you then basically take the cooked product out without recontaminating it. So there's some of the processes that you can employ. But as I said, you have to deal with all the raw materials, packing. How are you going to get the waste back out again? How do you deal with humans? So how are you going to get workers in, and maintenance and those sort of things? Tools, cleaning equipment, all of that has to be dealt with. And one of the major ways in which you can deal with that is to have captive equipment. So basically all your cleaning tools, all of your maintenance tools live inside that zone and don't exit. And to get those in, you can bake them through an oven, you can go through a sanitizer wash or those sort of things. And you have to have floor to ceiling barriers, because Listeria doesn't care about the blue line on the floor that you still see in the industry. It doesn't care if you have a waist-high wall. It still gets into aerosols, it flows around in water, and it gets through those sort of barriers if they don't completely cover floor to ceiling. You have to have the right change procedures. You need to have the right treatment for raw and packaging materials. And as I said, that can include heat, sanitizers, double bagging, and so on to deal with those situations. So the physical barriers have to go into the right spots as well. So you have to think about the layout and product flow. So you lose efficiency otherwise. You have to have appropriate traffic control. So the layout and retrofitting factories often is quite difficult because of that. It's much easier to start from scratch. But if you think about it carefully, retrofitting is often possible as well. You need to have good employee practices. And on the right-hand side, you can see the picture with the benches. So basically on the outside, you take off your boots or shoes, whatever you're wearing before, you swing over, and then you go into captive personal protective equipment and boots and coats and hairnets and so on. But that's on the high care or high risk side. So you need to have some sort of separation. You need to have the right hand washing and sanitizing procedures. Boot washing is quite critical. And generally it would be recommended that you clean the boots on the way back out, not on the way in. And that allows any food that was as a residue on the boots to be removed at the end of the shift, and the boots to dry overnight, so you're then not walking wet, potentially contaminated boots straight back into the factory. So there are lots of things to think about in that space. You need to eliminate equipment and facility risks. So, you know, your design and maintenance is quite important. Having clean welds, like it's shown on the right-hand side, those sort of things are critical. Again, you want to avoid harborage sites where Listeria mono can potentially occur. Drainage is an ever ongoing problem. That's where you're going to have deep cleaning happen regularly, because obviously that's a place where Listeria can accumulate. You're going to have water, you're going to have food for it to grow, and biofilms form quite easily. And you need to make sure that you're not connecting your high care, high risk areas to the lower risk areas, because otherwise you can get backflush and those sort of things causing problems. Air handling is important because these microorganisms travel in aerosols. So generally what you would look at is positive pressure to keep those sort of aerosols out of the high care, high risk zones. So that requires a fair bit of air handling, and you need enough airflow to stop condensation. As I said, condensation points are a big problem for Listeria occurring. And so if you can avoid condensation through proper airflow design, then that's much preferable. Cleaning and sanitizing is crucial. On the right top there, you see an image of Listeria mono in stainless steel. So that's 2 days at 20 degrees. So it doesn't take long before you start getting those biofilms. And it only takes a few seconds to minutes for a single organism to actually attach to that surface. And so at that stage, you're basically starting the process of biofilm formation. And so to be able to effectively clean, you have to basically use mechanical action to start removing those biofilms. And only then can you really start sanitizing and killing the remaining organisms. So the focus is really to keep Listeria away from food contact surfaces. That includes pumps and cutting surfaces and slicers and all those sort of things that are difficult to clean as well. all of those are food contact surfaces. So you need to disassemble those. You need to go through a regular cleaning and sanitizing process. The only way, though, whether you know you're going to be successful with your strategies is to look at your targeted environmental monitoring and testing. Testing in food is all good and well, and it tells you whether you find something there if there was gross contamination. But you're trying to stop that contamination in the first place. So you have to start looking where in your factory environment or kitchen environment you're going to find Listeria. And one good technique that you can use is to use hot spotting. So if you always find it in the same areas, over time you get a picture that actually clearly shows that where you're going to find this organism. And if that's on a food contact surface, you'll have to do additional action. You can't just do clean. You have to actually then do a risk assessment. Is it going to be in the food? Is it able to grow? What are we going to do with this particular issue? And at the very minimum, you would have to do a significant re-clean and retest to make sure that you've actually gotten rid of the problem. So that frozen vegetable recall that I talked about in Europe, that was caused because you had belts that were actually not cleaned properly, and that's where the Listeria mono actually accumulated and got into the frozen products. And they found it in the products as well as on the belts. I've mentioned shelf life. It's really quite critical that we set the right shelf life, because if we don't, and there are no inhibiting factors in the food, Listeria mono will grow. And we need to make sure, obviously, that our temperature is maintained below 5 degrees, as it is required for potentially pathogen supporting our foods. Now, that doesn't mean that Listeria can't grow, but obviously if the temperature goes above, it grows that much faster. That lag period is that much shorter, and therefore you can't achieve your shelf life. And then if it's a heat or reheated high-risk food, you need to start thinking how you actually reheat it, especially if you're going to serve it to vulnerable populations. So generally the advice is that food should be steaming hot. If there's no instructions, stir the food and make sure the whole food gets hot. As we saw, 85 degrees for 1 second will kill Listeria. So we need to make sure the temperature gets hot enough. But if you're following specific processes and you need to make sure that the food is not too hot, say in a hospital setting, you need to make sure that you actually meet the minimum requirements, and that should be in a food safety plan. So it could be 72 degrees for 2 minutes or something equivalent. But that has to be at the core of the product, and you need to measure the temperature, because if you don't measure it, you don't really know whether you're going to achieve the right temperature in the first place. And if you don't, basically Listeria is not going to get killed. So we've gone through quite a few different points today. We basically looked at why Listeria monocytogenes is so successful. We looked at the impact on vulnerable populations, and we looked at some of the food safety strategies. Obviously, there's a lot more to it as well, but this just gives you a bit of an idea of where to start, and it also gives you a bit of a framework of where the high risk and high care food industry is moving and the type of systems that are being implemented. What we're talking about here is best practice, but it's no longer just a requirement that may be done in the future. It's basically embedded in all of the retailer standards, and it's also embedded in the GFSI standards. So there are lots of different requirements in those as well that can help you actually start to implement solutions as far as your own facilities go. So thank you very much for listening today. I hope you got something out of it. As I said, if you go into the group chat, if you have any questions, I can answer those now as well. If you don't have any, well, thank you very much for attending. And if you do, please stick around and I'll be answering those questions now.